Well, here's what we've done so far, and I thought we'd note where we're headed. I want to give you at least a couple of weeks' notice so you'll know what to prepare. We always try to do these classes in an inductive way. That is, where you read ahead of time, and you write down questions and notes. What would you say if you were teaching the class? What do you think ought to be covered? What have you wondered about? Or what did the text answer for you this time? Maybe as you look at it again, say, boy, I never recognized that before. And if you'll contact me at that solid faith at Outlook, we'll try to incorporate that in our class. So anyway, then we'll go toward Mount Sinai. And then as we move into February, we'll see the covenant the Lord gives, the laws that are part of the covenant, the tabernacle description. This is exactly how it's to be done. And then Moses following through, and the book will end with that tabernacle, that tent set up for the worship and praise of God. I see a couple of people that are back with us today. We've missed you. We're glad to see you again. All right, so let's think about crossing the Red Sea. And we'll try to do basically an overall outline, and then we'll dig in a bit deeper. And if you're subscribed to servingandsharing.com, you would have already received these notes in your email, right? So first we'll see the progress that God leads Israel. There's the starting point, and the journey begins. We love what we read about Joseph's bones. We'll come to that. And then that pillar of cloud during the day, and a pillar or column of fire by night, so that the people always know how long to stay where they are, when to get up, how far to go, where to land. Sometimes you and I might wish we had something like that today, right? Lord, just show me. Give me if there were some kind of sign like they had. Very special for them. And then pursuit. Pharaoh says, oh no, our free slave labor, they're getting away. What have we done? And his heart is hardened again, and he goes after them. So then we're going to see Israel, again, in between the enemy and this impassable sea, and they're going to panic. And who do you think they're going to blame? Moses. Weren't there enough graves in Egypt? You just brought us here to die? And we're going to see how that sets the stage for really the next 40 years, right? The complaining, the murmuring, the unhappiness, and the criticism that Moses will experience again and again. God has the Jews turn back. That's why the word wandering is there. He says to Moses, tell the people to turn back. Well, when they turn back, it's a trap for Pharaoh, because Pharaoh here, they're lost, they're aimless, they don't really have a map, they're confused. God's plan that we see unfold. So then the pathway, God delivers Israel, and we'll talk quite a bit about that. And the Egyptians, I thought as I was preparing for today, what were the Egyptians thinking? You know, after all those plagues, do they really think they're going to be able to catch the Israelites to begin with? And how can 600 best chariots and then all the chariots of Egypt? I thought, all the king's horses and all the king's men, the people that God leads. So why should we fear 600 chariots or all the chariots of the land or whatever forces there may be challenging us? And then praise. We're going to see this song written in poetry, a celebration that the Lord is our strength, He's our song, He's become our salvation. And that's what our worship is today as well. Focused on who God is and what He provides for us and His deliverance from sin and death. So I know this is small. It's the best I can do. This is the most common route indicated for the Exodus. And if you look toward the upper left part of the screen, you'll see the starting point. You'll see Ramses. It was mentioned in chapter 12, 37. That city that the slaves of Israel had been forced to help build. And then they come down to Succoth. That's a Hebrew word meaning booths. And later they will live in like booths or tents in the wilderness. And then they come down to Etham, and they turn back toward Pi-Hahiroth by the Red Sea, and that's where Pharaoh thinks, hey, now I've got them. And then Baal-Zephon. They'll go through the Red Sea and then the wilderness of Shur. And if you zoom in a little bit, you'll be able to see that. Then the journey continues. Marah, where they'll deal with issues about the water. Elim, with the 12 springs of water. The wilderness of Sin. We always remember that's not sin like we think of sin as disobedience to God. It's just the name of that area. And then Rephidim, also called Massa and Meribah, issues with the water again. The wilderness near the mount, and then the wilderness of Sinai in front of the mountain. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you see Mount Sinai, also called Horeb. We need to note that some of the places named in Exodus have not been identified today, and you can understand that. There's not a sign out there that Moses put up that said, "This way to Marah." And so as scientists dig, they're going to find certain evidences, but they're not necessarily going to be able to locate. We don't expect that to happen all along the way. In addition, we're not certain exactly where even Mount Sinai was. The spot mentioned here is called today in that land Jebel Musa, Mountain of Moses. And so most scholars think, and this is quite reasonable, that that is the place where the great events of chapters 19 and 20 occurred. But you'll see them up toward the top of the Red Sea, I say top of this map, the crossing up there near Sukkoth, and then over to the other side. So here's a question. If you wanted to get from point A to point B, would you go the way they went? Or would you say, hey, there's a highway. Look at the line I've drawn from, I wanted to drive that road, from Ramses to Canaan. Doesn't it make more sense? Think of the time you'd save, the mileage, right? Why would God not take the Hebrews on the most direct way possible? I'll ask the class. I think Ron has an answer for us. Because of the Philistines. Go ahead. Yes, that road is the area of the Philistines. And God said if the Hebrews see war, they're going to be discouraged, they're going to be afraid, they're going to change their minds, and they're going to go back to Egypt. Steve? I think you can also go farther, and God knew that he needed time to create a nation out of a bunch of slaves. And one of the greatest ways to do that, to bond people together, is through hardships and difficulties, which is kind of what happened. Good. Through hardships and difficulties, God will take the time to forge and fashion his people. They don't go instantly to Mount Sinai. There's going to be some experiences along the way, some difficulties. And by getting through those issues, they'll see that God will lead them, God will protect them, God will care for them. Good. Yes? Because of his foreknowledge, I think God knew what he was dealing with the nation of Israel. Yes. Eventually on, see how he deals with unbelief. Good. God knows their tendencies and ours. He knows that we judge things by what we see and not by what God sees. That the visible, tangible, present world, we are in front of it, we're exposed to it, and we don't see the one who is unseen. And before I forget it, let me mention Hebrews 11 says that Moses and the people of Israel left as seeing him who is unseen. Think about that. Or remember Romans 1. Remember the invisible qualities of God, the things you can't see, are clearly perceived through the things that God has made. And so God accommodates. It's amazing. God reroutes the people. And he says specifically, this is the reason. They're not where they need to be. They're not as mature. They're not as strong. And so sometimes God will rebuke them or us for not having more confidence and assurance and boldness. And sometimes God will say, I know this would be too tough for them right now. I think of 1 Corinthians 10. He will not allow you to be tempted. What? Beyond what you're able to bear, but He'll what? With the temptation. Remember the title of our series, God Makes the Way? So that you may escape temptation and stand under it and endure such matters. Good. Okay, so we're in Exodus 13, 17 through 22. So as you look that over, see what further comment you want to make. This initial point we've made is right there. You can see God's word regarding the people. And so, verse 18, He took them by the way of the wilderness in martial array, this Bible says. That is, this is an army. Elsewhere, He will call them His hosts. These are God's troops. They may not think of themselves that way yet, but this is part of the forging process that Steve was talking about. And then we'll come to verse 19 and following and take some time to think about Joseph and their treatment of his bones. We mentioned Succoth, and then Etham on the edge of the wilderness, and the pillar of cloud and pillar of fire. And verse 22, He never took them away. I love that. That was the visible expression of God's presence. Whenever you wonder, are we in the right place? Hey, there's the cloud. We are. There's the fire. We're good. All right. Yes, Greg? I don't think they have a map. They're one, right? They had the best map. That's right. The pillar of fire, the cloud. That's right. They had the best map of all. That's right. And you know, Greg, all Israel has to think about is the next step. They don't have to have the whole picture because God does. To me, I love the GPS, don't you? My favorite phrase is when the lady says, "You have arrived." But with the GPS, I only see the next turn. Do you find that too? And I don't always know exactly where I'm going. Am I alone in that? And I think about how God took His people step by step. And we sing about that too. Good. All right, so we talked about that. I thought of Psalm 103. As a father has compassion on his children, so our God has compassion on us. He is mindful of our frame. He knows that we are only made of dust. We're feeble. We're mortal. We are weak. We are not able to direct our own paths. And so God actually works the map that way for them. I want to talk about the bones of Joseph. It's one of my favorite themes. At the end of Genesis chapter 50, Joseph dies. And he tells his brothers, he knows, they all know the promise going back to Abraham. And he says, God is going to bring you out of this land. And when He does, take my bones with you. I don't want to be buried here. We talk about being in the world but not of the world. We say you can take the boy out of the country, but you can't what? Take the country out of the boy. Joseph knows who he is. He knows where his home is and where he wants to be laid to rest. And so he dies, and his body's placed in his coffin, but it's never buried in Egypt. As great as he was, he didn't get one of these big tombs like you read about King Tut's and others and so forth. And so all that time, the Hebrews might have had Joseph's coffin where they could see it. I don't know if they did. And it would remind them of what? God's promise in the past and their departure in the future. And so Moses was careful. They carried Joseph's coffin across the Red Sea, from city to city, from place to place to place. And it's not until Joshua 24:32, if you want to look there, that his body is buried in the area related to Shechem, and that's when they fulfilled their commitment regarding what he had said. So let's go to, I think, Hebrews 11:22. We won't turn, but you can. In the heroes of faith, the one thing that's said about Joseph, you could talk about his dreams, you could talk about Potiphar's wife and his morality, you could talk about his rising from the pit and so forth. The one thing mentioned is that by faith, when Joseph was dying, he made mention of his bones. Acts 7:15 and 16. I think we will turn to that one. I will, to Acts 7. You want to be familiar with Acts 7 because it's Stephen's retelling of the events of the past, of which the Sanhedrin, who are holding court with him, would have known very well. But there's a theme running through Acts 7, several. One is that Joseph was not recognized for who he was until his second appearance. And Moses was not recognized as the true leader of Israel until his second appearance. Remember the first time he killed the Egyptian and fled. What does that tell you about Jesus? Jesus had been rejected as King of Kings and the Lord of Lords the first time. But guess what? He's coming again. And there's a thread that runs through Stephen's speech that the leader that's rejected, the Savior that's cast away, comes back again and is then acknowledged. But Acts 7, let's see what we had, verses, all right, you've got Joseph and the people coming to him. And then verse 15, Jacob went down to Egypt. Verse 16, from there they were removed to Shechem and laid in the tomb which Abraham had purchased for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. Any thoughts about that? Okay. So I wanted to tell you something about the Hebrew word often rendered visit. We hear that term, we think of going to see somebody, maybe sitting with them for a while. But it has to do with showing regard and compassion and awareness and concern. And often your Bible may say God is concerned about you, and it's this Hebrew word. Joseph used it in Genesis 50. God will visit you and take you out of this land. Exodus 3 uses the word twice, and this is a Hebrew-ism. Visiting, I have visited you. To use the word twice. And so we usually understand that I will certainly visit you. Without a doubt, I will visit you. And it helps you understand Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats. I was sick and you what? Visited me. Or James 1:27. This is pure religion. To do what? Visit the widows and the orphans. And I may have left out Ruth. I meant to add the verse in Ruth where after the famine, and she's gone to Moab, Naomi's gone to Moab, then the word comes that God had visited his people. That is, there's now bread back in Bethlehem. It helps us understand how we relate to each other in this faith builders, friend builders, as brothers and sisters in Christ. And then the cloud and fire. I'm not going to go through all of those, but you'll have this either in the notes last week or you can see it tomorrow in the PDF. And just notice how often the cloud, there's a Hebrew word, Shekinah. And Shekinah has to do with the glory cloud. And when the tabernacle is erected or the temple is completed by Solomon, the cloud will fill the house. Or in the transfiguration, when Jesus is there and briefly Moses and Elijah appear, here comes the glory cloud. It's a fascinating study all through the Bible. All right, so now I think we've already mentioned Pharaoh. Turn back, God says. Pharaoh's going to come after you. He's going to think you're, misdirected, your GPS broke or something. Oh no, let's go get them. And so the select chariots and all the chariots. And I'm thinking, haven't you learned by now, Pharaoh? There's nothing you can do to stop the true God after the plagues and so forth. So then they have the panic attack. I thought of the phrase, between the devil and the deep blue sea, right? Here he is with all of his forces. And in front of us, I should say the deep Red Sea. I'll try to fix that next time. Moses, hey, aren't there enough graves in Egypt? We could have just died there. And we'll find throughout the next 40 years, the Israelites will talk about how wonderful their life was in Egypt. Have you seen that? Oh, we had all this food to eat, and we were comfortable, and we were happy, and it was great. It is so easy when you're under stress to exaggerate and glorify what used to be. We could talk about the good old days, couldn't we? And there are good old days. But sometimes the good old days might look even better than they were because of the present time in which we live. There's always been temptation. There's always been affliction. There's always been those opportunities to hold our faith no matter what. Steve?
Just like Pharaoh should have remembered the power of God, so should the Israelites. But this is why, in the New Testament it tells us that Jesus even says, signs and wonders are not going to keep you faith or make you believe. I mean, here we have this example of all these signs and wonders, everything possible shown and done for the Israelites, and it still does not give them enough faith to stay forward. That should give us some hope today, because we don't see the signs and wonders. But God is still moving mountains for us. We just don't know which one will win.
Steve said signs and wonders don't necessarily force people into faith. We know that. Same people can witness the same things. Steve, it makes me think of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And all of a sudden, the leaders of the Jews say, now we have to kill two people. We have to kill Lazarus as well. Because even these signs Jesus did, if you were hard-hearted, if you were unwilling, then God's show of power, again, would further harden those that defied him. Very good point. Steve also mentioned that we don't see such signs and wonders today. And I'm glad you said that, because even in Bible times, there's not a miracle on every page. How many times did God part the water and bring his people across? A trick question. There's a second time, isn't there? The Jordan River with Joshua, and God somewhat repeats this event. But there are so many things in the Bible that are uniquely suited to that occasion and that time, that are really part of redemption. Good. Okay, so better to be living slaves in Egypt than dead escapees here. And I think this is a pattern. We call it running the bases. A lack of faith. If you don't have faith, what's going to come in? Fear. Fear. They cry to God, and then they complain about Moses. We ever see that today? This is history. This is the way people can be sometimes. And what we want to do is call each other back to trusting God, obeying God. And that will resolve so many matters. All right, so now here we come to the deliverance through the sea. And there's a time that Israel is to stand still. They almost have to. What are they going to do next? Sometimes individuals think that we're so much in control, we have so much wisdom that we can always know. And sometimes we think unless we're busy doing something, we're not really serving God. But there are those times when you have to wait and watch and depend on the Lord. And it doesn't happen right when you think it should. So here's the leader's role. Pick up your staff, Moses, and tell the people, move. You know, we're in the process of identifying and nominating additional elders and deacons as well. The elders will be our overseers, our shepherds. And that kind of person that can stand up and pick up the staff and say, let's go. There is a world to be conquered. There is a sea to cross. There is a future God has in store. This is Moses, you might say, at his best. And you also notice that God used overnight. Did you see how the cloud stayed between the Israelites and the Egyptians? And actually provided light and also a barrier until the morning. And then God brought a strong east wind that pushed the water into the two walls on both sides. It's interesting how God uses natural means to do supernatural things. So, who's going to go first? Who's going to go first? I don't know, that water's kind of deep. Maybe can't quite see the other side. Here's my family. Here's my spouse and my children. And they're looking at me. They're looking at you. What are you going to do? And the principle applies to the family today, especially for fathers, right? To rise up, O men of God, and say to family, we are going to serve God. We're going to move forward. We've been stuck. It's time to grow. It's time to stretch. It's time to be better and do more than in the past. So Egyptians, not too smart. After all those plagues, they follow, and then God brings the water. Oh, and by the way, before they perish, they call the name of Yahweh. He's fighting for Israel. What are we doing? Turn back. And it's too little and too late. And at the end of chapter 14, Israel sees and fears and believes. I believe that's certainly true for us today. We see the power of God, the wrath of God, the grace of God in their experience, so visibly and clearly demonstrated. And so we fear, who is this God? And we believe and we trust and we obey. Any more comment here? Okay, well, chapter 15, we come to this poetic section, beautiful celebration of the victory that God has provided. Oh, I wanted to mention chapter 14, 19. I don't know that we did, but the angel of God that had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. And that's what provided the barrier and the light. Verse 20. There was the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night. But yes, go ahead. Yes. Yes. Good. That's where we are. Greg mentioned that here's doubting Thomas, as we call him, Thomas the twin, Didymus. And I'm not going to believe unless I touch him and so forth. And Jesus said, put your hand here. And then he said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And part of the reason we believe is because people like Thomas didn't believe. And their experience, when he said, my Lord and my God, talking to Jesus, that helps us to put ourselves in his position also. But that's where we are. Do you think you'd like to have been there when the Red Sea was parted? If you had, would you have been calm? Would you have been steady? Or would you have been alarmed? Anybody have a comment? What's that? Okay, Myron said in awe, especially when you see it happen. And then you're finally, I don't know. Would you be wondering as you go into it how long this road is going to be there for you? And are you sort of taking step by step? I don't know. We're not told. But then when you look back, and you see what's happened to Pharaoh, all the king's horses and all the king's men. Wow. Steve? Good point. The things that we deal with, if we learn from the past, are not nearly as daunting as they might otherwise be. Romans 8, 31 to 39. What can separate? We are more than conquerors. Famine, nakedness, peril, sword. If that were being written today, COVID-19 with all of its varieties. We have a God who is able to provide for the future, sometimes by delivering people from their hardship, and sometimes by bringing them through it. This is another point in Hebrews 11, that there are those that because of their faith, they were brought back to life, or they did experience deliverance and salvation, but there were others who were put to death, who were even sawn in two. There were those that didn't experience a miraculous rescue, even in biblical times, but God brought them through. Sometimes He took them over it, around it, under it, but sometimes through it. And that's where faith grows, is in the adversity. Anyone else? Anything else about the Red Sea you want to ask or mention? Okay. So now we come with a song of praise. And I was reading the Truth for Today. I want to credit my former colleague, Dr. Coy Roper, wrote the Exodus commentary in the Truth for Today series. You may be familiar with it, these red volumes. And he noted, perhaps from another source, that there are two stanzas here. The first one, it goes back and forth. Here's who God is, and here's what He's done. Here's who God is, and here's what He's done. Back and forth and back and forth. So you have an introduction. The Lord is highly exalted. He has hurled the horse and its rider into the sea. And then you have who He is. He's my strength, my song, my salvation. He's my God. He is a warrior. He's a fighter. He's the leader of His troops. And so what has He done? Well, He's cast Pharaoh's chariots and army into the sea. So who is He? He's majestic in power, able to overthrow His enemies. What has He done? He used the waters and the wind to defeat Pharaoh's army. Who is He? He's greater than all the so-called gods, majestic in holiness, a worker of wonders. Some years ago, I had a teacher that taught us to sing Exodus 15:11. I'm not going to try it with you today because I know we don't know it as a group, but it says, "Who is like unto you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like unto you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders? Who is like unto you?" And then the song I learned added a second verse. "No one is like unto you, O Lord, among the gods. No one is like unto you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders. No one is like unto you." That's beautiful, beautiful. And so what has He done? Well, He caused the earth to swallow His enemies. He brought His people to His holy habitation. We'll be singing in the worship service in a bit. There is a habitation, and God brought His people to a habitation. Now there's a second stanza, and this one focuses, starting at verse 13, on the results or the consequences. So Israel, guided to God's holy habitation. That's kind of perhaps move from stanza 1 to stanza 2. And for the nations, the Philistines, Edomites, Moabites, and Canaanites would be afraid. Notice how what God does with Israel shines a light for the world. And I think one of you mentioned a week or two ago how when they came to Jericho, Rahab and the Canaanites had already heard about Yahweh and what he had done. For Israel, they'll be planted in God's chosen place. And that's verse 17. And conclusion, let God be praised forever. And then you'll see at the end of the chapter a celebration. A celebration with Miriam and the women. Miriam takes the tambourine and sings, and there's dancing, and they're jubilant. They can't contain themselves because of the experience they've had. What Miriam and the women did was not a pattern for the ongoing worship of Israel. This is not something you see as a regular part of their worship to God. But you'll see something like this again when King David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, right? And there's like a parade. We might call it almost like a ticker-tape parade, if I could say that. There are certain times in Israel's history when God has done something and they cannot contain themselves out of their joy. And I want to close with this thought. In our own worship toward God, we understand what the New Testament authorizes, and we're never going to stray from that. This church, our elders, all of us are committed to doing in worship exactly what the New Testament has prescribed. We do those things with joy and with gratitude and enthusiasm. And so our singing is vibrant. It is alive. It is glorious. And in all that we do to worship God, we want to do it as if we understand, like 1 Corinthians 10 says, those people were baptized into Moses, in the cloud, and in the sea. And on the other side, they were thankful. And so as we follow what God has prescribed in the New Testament as the ways that we worship, we want to do so with that kind of wonder and awe and adoration toward God. Thank you for being in our class. Those that are with us online, we would love to hear from you. solid.faith@outlook.com. If you want to subscribe and receive notes during the week, just let us know that. servingandsharing.com. Also remember, friend builders after our morning worship. Friend builders will spend some time with each other over in room 33. Thank you.